This is the first lecture in the topic called capital structure. I'm going to take the first few minutes time to talk about this topic from an examination perspective. And after that, I will give an introduction to this topic and then I will start discussing the concepts in this topic area. So let's first have an understanding about this topic from an examination perspective. Let's understand what this topic would mean to us from the exam perspective. So the first thing I would like to tell you is I'm going to break this topic into two parts. I'm going to break capital structure into two parts. The first part is called as EBIT to EPS analysis. And the second part, I would like to call it as remaining concepts in capital structure. So let me call the first part as EBIT to EPS analysis, and then let me call the second part as remaining concepts. So I would like to break this topic into two parts like this. Now, the reason I am breaking up this topic into two parts is one, I would like to tell you that one of these two parts we have already covered earlier. In fact, we have covered this first part, which is called as EBIT to EPS analysis. We have already covered this. And what we are going to be focusing on right now is the second part, which is going to be the remaining concepts. So in fact, if you recollect in the lectures in EBIT to EPS analysis, this breakup of the topic called capital structure is something that I would have mentioned. And I would have also told you that one of the subtopics in capital structure is what we're actually discussing, and the other topics and other concepts in capital structure we will take up for discussion later. So one reason is for me to break this topic into two is to tell you that we have looked into one, we are going to be looking into the other part. More importantly, the other reason why I would like to break this topic into two parts is because from the perspective of exam, as far as I have looked into the past exam question papers, I feel that you are likely to get more questions from the first part. So EBIT to EPS analysis is more common with respect to its appearance in the exam question paper. Now, this does not definitely mean that the second part, which would contain the remaining concepts in capital structure, is not important from an exam perspective. So that's not the message that I'm trying to convey here. But all I'm saying is based on my analysis of past exam question papers, I've seen more questions from EBIT to EPS analysis than questions from the remaining concepts in this topic called capital structure. So that's another reason why I would like to break this topic. So as far as the exam is concerned, if the past trend is going to continue, then you can expect EBIT to EPS analysis more common than the other concept areas. So this is another reason. And as far as my analysis is concerned, I can probably say something like a 60-40 or a 70-30 to be precise. 70% chance of your question in capital structure being from EBIT to EPS analysis, and 30% chance of your question in capital structure from remaining concepts. That's about the split up of this topic. And as far as the marks in the exam is concerned, you can either get a 5 marks question or you can get a 10 marks question. So, but there's generally one question that comes from capital structure. So if EBIT to EPS analysis is tested, it can either be a 5 marks question or it can be a 10 marks question. So we have seen the concepts within EBIT to EPS analysis, they lend themselves to be tested through a 5 marks question or through a 10 marks question. So if EBIT to EPS analysis is going to appear in the exam, it could either be a 5 marks question or it could be a 10 marks question. If capital structure, the remaining concepts in capital structure is going to appear in the exam. Here again, you could either get a 5 marks question or you could get a 10 marks question. We cannot really say, because there are concepts which can get tested through a 5 marks question, and there are also concepts that can get tested through a 10 marks question. So we really cannot say which one of the two we can definitely expect. It could be any one of the two. But what's important here to observe is, if at all you get a 5 marks question, this would mean that this is a compulsory question. And there have been instances in the past when a question from capital structure formed part of the compulsory question. So if I have to sum up all of these things, I would say that this topic can be spread across the FM exam. It could either be a part of the compulsory question, or it could be part of the other questions which are for 10 marks each. So anything, and in fact, you could probably also get a question from capital structure as a part of your theory question. So from that perspective, any part of the FM exam question paper could test you on this topic area called capital structure. But the very nice part about it is that most questions come from EBIT to EPS analysis. So, and we have definitely seen that EBIT to EPS analysis is a very easy topic area from the perspective of preparation and also from the perspective of scoring in the exam. So, since that's the case, we really probably do not care whether it comes as a 5 marks question or as a 10 marks question. Now, as far as the other concepts are concerned, the remaining concepts, let's look at how I would probably classify this. Would I classify this to be easy, or would I classify this to be difficult, or would I classify this to be somewhere in between? Now I'm going to make a statement and also qualify it. I'm going to say the remaining concepts would be easy but require thorough understanding. So I'm going to say the remaining concepts would be easy but require thorough understanding. Now, why do I say this? This is mainly because this is a topic where you either know something or you don't know that. There is very little room for you to go around guessing something in the exam. So there are individual concepts, you need to know them completely. If you know them, then they become very easy. And as far as the question in the exam is concerned, all of those will be very easy for you to tackle if you know the concept thoroughly. But for some reason, if you do not know a concept, or if you're stuck somewhere in between, or if you miss to look at that concept, then a question in the exam is no way guessable by you. You cannot go around guessing in any way. So from that perspective, then that question in the exam would become very difficult for you. So I would not call this as a difficult topic as such. I would call this as an easy topic, but I would immediately modify it by saying it is easy, but it requires a thorough understanding. And yet another point I would like to add on here when I say it requires a thorough understanding is the concepts could be pretty abstract. Abstract concepts. Again, what I mean when I say abstract concepts is these are things which need to be understood in a very particular way. And till you get a complete understanding of it, a few concepts also have the potential to appear vague when you approach it for the first time. So when you're listening to a certain concept, you might not be easily able to guess what is ahead. And at the same time, you might want to listen to it once more or twice more for you to get a lot more clarity in that concept. So that's that's how I would like to define the word abstract in this context here when I say the concepts are abstract. But even though the concepts are abstract, they are going to be easy only. All that is required is a thorough understanding of the concepts. So this is what I would like to tell you about this topic called capital structure from an examination perspective. Now that we are done about this, now that we are done looking at this topic from an examination perspective, we are going to have an introduction to this topic area. And the first part of the introduction is going to be a big picture understanding. Now, what do I mean when I say a big picture understanding? I'm going to first talk about this topic in the big picture of the financial management function. So we have been discussing topics all along from the beginning. So where does this topic capital structure fit in the big picture? So the big picture here I'm talking about is the big picture of the financial management function. So in the financial management function, where can I place capital structure? And this is something that we have always been actually doing. So whatever topic we discuss, the first thing that we have always been looking at is where in the big picture would we place this topic. That's kind of important to understand, because only then it'll be easy for us to appreciate how knowledge in that topic is going to help a person discharge the financial management function. So how would the principles contained in this topic help me if I should discharge my function as a financial, if I should discharge my responsibilities as a financial manager? So if I should discharge the FM function, how will these concepts help me is something I should understand. At least in theory, how would these concepts help me? Even though many of them may not have immediate practical relevance, how would it, at least in theory, help me to think about a certain things? So that's the goal of the big picture understanding. So, like we have always done in the previous discussions, we understand that the function of financial management is broken up into three parts basically, and this threefold classification is based on the three important decisions that the function of financial management is concerned with. The first decision we call as financing decisions, and the second type of decisions are investing decisions, and the third type of decisions are called as dividend decisions. So these are the three types of decisions which the function of financial management is closely linked with. So a manager who is discharging, a financial manager who is discharging his responsibility or is carrying out, is managing finance is basically talking about taking these three decisions: financing decisions, investing decisions, and dividend decisions. And all the topics that we have been discussing till now, we were able to classify them in one or more of these decisions. We have discussed capital budgeting and risk analysis in capital budgeting, which we classified in investing decisions. Then we have discussed EBIT to EPS analysis. In fact, as a part of this topic itself, as forming part of financing decisions, we have discussed leverages, which form part of financing decisions, and we have discussed cost of capital. Again, that cost of capital is a chapter that can be classified in the first bucket here, financing decisions. And we have also looked at dividend decisions, which is basically the third type of decision that you see here. So all along, what we do is whenever we start looking at a certain topic, we classify that in one of the three buckets here. So where do we place capital structure? Now, well, as you might have rightly guessed, I'm going to place capital structure in the first bucket here, and that's basically under financing decisions. So capital structure is going to be placed under financing decisions, and we understand what we mean by financing decisions regarding the sources from which finance has to be raised. So those decisions are called as financing decisions, and capital structure is going to be placed in that bucket. Now, how is capital structure going to help us take financing decisions? That's the next discussion that we will have to have right now. Now that we understand that capital structure is placed within financing decisions, how is capital structure going to help us take financing decisions? So first thing is, let us put forth the main question here. Now, in most topics that we have discussed all along, we have always seen that there is a bigger question that we try to answer. So, for instance, in the topic dividend decisions, the main question that we had to answer was, should a company declare dividend or not? Or if it has to declare dividend, if it decides to declare dividend, how much of dividend should it declare? So basically, this was the question that we sought an answer to. So now, in capital structure, what is the question that we are trying to answer? So it's pretty simple. The question that we're trying to answer is, how should a company structure its capital? So the question is as simple as this: how should a company structure its capital? And essentially, if you paraphrase this question, if you try to uh, understand what this question means, you actually understand that a simplified or a paraphrase of this question is, where should a company raise finance from? Where should a company raise finance from? So basically, the question that we tried to seek an answer to when we discussed cost of capital, the question that we tried to seek an answer to when we looked at EBIT to EPS analysis, the question that we tried to seek an answer to when we discussed the topic leverages, in fact, that's the same question that we are trying to seek an answer to right now when we discuss concepts in capital structure. So basically, how should a company structure its capital? And we definitely understand the meaning of capital. We've had several opportunities in the past when we tried to focus on understanding what capital meant. And in all those places, what we have understood is capital refers to long-term finance. Basically, finance which has been raised on a long-term basis. That's what we understand by capital. So how do I structure my capital? So capital is basically long-term finance. But when I say how I should, when I talk about structuring the capital, basically I'm asking myself a question: where do I raise finance? That's the main question. So should I structure my capital in such a way that the majority of the capital is in the form of equity and probably a little bit is in the form of debt? Or should I structure my capital in such a way that 50% of my capital is in the form of equity and the balance 50% is in the form of debt? Or should I structure my capital in such a way that the majority of the capital is in the form of debt and the balance, which probably is a very small part, is in the form of equity? So how do I do that? So that's basically what I mean when I talk about structuring capital. And you can see how it is linked with raising finance. So if you choose to raise finance predominantly from one source, then actually what you're saying is, that's how I want to structure my capital. So a company which predominantly goes about to raise finance in the form of equity is planning to structure its capital in such a way that the majority of the capital is equity. So structuring capital is very closely connected with raising finance. So the main question here we are trying to answer is, how should a company structure its capital? Now, we understand that this question is important because there is more than one choice available for a company. There is more than one way in which a capital can be structured. There are multiple ways in which multiple sources from which finance can be raised. So that's exactly why this question is important. But we also understand that answering this question is not very straightforward. Now, what I mean when I say answering this question is not very straightforward is, basically I say that there is no one method to seek an answer to this. Let's look into this a little more. Now, let's say there are two choices for me. One choice is to have majority of my capital in the form of debt, and the other choice is to have have majority of my capital in the form of equity. So when I have majority debt, that means a very small share of my capital is equity, and when I say majority equity, a very small portion of my capital is in the form of debt. Let's say these are the only two choices I have with me right now. Now, what should I look into, or what are the several things that would go inside the decision-making process? Now, one of the things that I could consider would be cost, and this is what we saw elaborately in the concept in the topic called as cost of capital. So one of the things I would probably look at is cost, because every source of capital has a cost associated. That's what we call as the component cost of capital. So when I look at raising finance from different sources, what is the cost associated with each source? That is something I would probably be interested in looking at. But we understand that that's not the only thing I look into. As much as cost is an important thing, just looking at cost would probably also not ensure that I take the right decision. For instance, generally we can expect debt to be a less costlier source of capital than equity, primarily because the investor in debt is taking less risk in investing its money, whereas the investor in equity is taking more risk when investing its money. So the debt investor accepts a lesser return because risk taken is lesser, but the equity investor asks for a higher return because the risk taken is higher. So we can expect the cost of debt to be lesser than the cost of equity. And in the discussion about a weighted average cost of capital, we understand that if a source of finance which is available at a cheaper cost occupies the majority proportion of the capital, then the overall cost is going to be very less. If cost of debt is lesser than cost of equity, and my entire and almost 90% of my capital structure is made up of debt, then I'm going to have a very, I would say, very uh, I can say a less cost of overall cost compared to a case where cost of my majority of my capital structure is made up of is equity, and cost of equity is higher than cost of debt. In those cases, the overall cost could be much higher. So cost is one thing that probably would make me look more at debt finance. But I understand that if I raise finance in the form of debt, for the investor, it is a risk free investment. But for the entity raising finance, it comes with a lot of risk. If I'm a company and I've raised a lot of finance in the form of debt, then I am subject to a lot of commitments. Even if I don't perform well in a certain period, I still would have to make interest or coupon payments to the entities which have given me debt finance. I cannot tell them, you know what, I have not done well this year, so I cannot pay you interest. That flexibility is something that I have only when I've raised finance in the form of equity. I pay dividends if I want to. I can avoid payment of dividends if I want to, if I choose to. So in terms of risk, for the entity raising finance, debt is much more riskier than equity. But in terms of cost, debt is cheaper. So looking at cost alone is not the best way to look at how a company has to structure its capital. Cost is one of the things. Probably risk associated is another thing that's looked into. Now, what is that the concepts in capital structure that we're now going to look at would look into to try to answer this question. So what is that one parameter that we are mainly going to be looking at to try to answer this question regarding the structuring of capital? Now, I'm going to say that the main thing that the one main parameter that most of the concepts in this topic area would look at to answer this question would be value of the firm. So here, when I say firm, I refer to, I'm using the word firm very broadly here, and I am referring to any entity that is considering raising finance and structuring its capital. So what I'm actually looking at here, or what these concepts would look at, is the value of the firm. Now let's understand how we get at the value of the firm. That's for discussion at a later point in time. But at a very high level, at a broad level, at a concept level, obviously any firm would like to maximize its value. Just like any individual would like to do things which would maximize his or her value, uh, a firm also would like to do things which would maximize its value. As a firm, as a company, if I'm valued at 100 crore today, then if I know that I can do a few things and my value would become let's say 120 crores, then I would definitely do that. So we understand at a high level that any firm will be interested in maximizing its value. So although we have not yet discussed what we mean by value of a firm or how we can calculate something called as a value of the firm, we understand that any rational firm would like to maximize its value. So let's put that here. A firm would always like to maximize its value. So that's an important inference that is going to help us like to maximize its value. So what we are now going to look at is we are going to be looking at the several possibilities of structuring capital, and we are going to look at the impact of each possibility on the value of the firm. So several possibilities could be there. The impact of each possibility on the value of the firm is going to be seen, and whichever alternative or whichever possibility is likely to increase the value of the firm, that's probably what we are going to be considering for structuring our capital. So impact of every possible capital structure on the value of the firm, and trying to look at the capital structure that maximizes the value of the firm. So now if I put all of these things together, if I put all the at this stage if I put all the lectures that we have had about financing decisions together, there is probably one topic called leverages, which focuses on capital structure from the risk perspective. So higher the debt component, higher the leverage, and higher the leverage, higher the risk. So leverages approaches financing decisions from the risk perspective. Cost of capital approaches financing decisions from the cost perspective. EBIT to EPS analysis, which is one topic in capital structure, approaches financing decisions from shareholders' wealth maximization perspective. And now we have capital structure, which is going to focus on financing decisions from the value of the firm perspective. And in fact, since we understand that shareholders' wealth maximization is the ultimate goal of any company, we can see that all of these things somehow or the other would point to shareholders' wealth maximization. So we're going to see how probably operating at at a lesser cost of capital would contribute to shareholders' wealth maximization. How increasing the value of the firm would again contribute to shareholders' wealth maximization. So as much as it might look like EBIT to EPS analysis is the only topic that directly looks at shareholders' wealth maximization, all the other topics indirectly still point out to shareholders' wealth maximization. So at a high level, it looks like all of these topics look at several parameters and try to answer the question regarding the structuring of a company's capital. So here it's important to understand that we are looking at the value of the firm. Now, with that understanding here, before we look at several concepts in this topic area, we are going to look at some fundamental principles and assumptions in this topic. Uh, we are going to basically look at four uh, principles or formulas, and we are going to look at five assumptions. These principles and assumptions are going to be very important as they would set the stage for all the conceptual discussions that is to follow. So there are going to be cases where we might not agree with one or two of the principles that we are going to discuss now, but that's absolutely fine. For most part of our discussion, we are going to be using these four principles and five assumptions. So now at this stage, after understanding the big picture and after understanding how capital structure fits in the big picture and understanding what is the main parameter capital structure looks at, now let's go to understand the basic principles associated with all the concepts, or at least I would say most of the concepts that we are going to be looking at. So it is worth committing to memory all of these principles after understanding what each of these would mean. So let me first put all of these principles in place, and then let's look at understanding each of those. So the first principle basically says value of a firm is equivalent to value of equity plus value of debt. So this is the first principle. So in the previous discussion, when we looked at the main parameter, we said capital structure focuses on the value of the firm. And at that point, I told you before even we understand how to approach the calculation of value of a firm, we understand that maximization of value of a firm is what any firm would be interested in. Now we look at the first principle, which focuses on value of a firm. It says value of a firm is value of equity plus value of debt. The second principle is value of debt is equivalent to interest divided by cost of debt. So this is the second principle. And the third principle is value of equity is equivalent to EBIT minus interest divided by cost of equity. And we have the fourth principle, which also talks about the value of the firm, which is value of the firm is EBIT divided by WACC. And we know WACC refers to weighted average cost of capital. So these are four very important principles that we would be looking at and understanding before we look at the concepts involved. And in addition to these four principles, there are going to be some basic assumptions that are also important for us to understand. Now, when we look at these basic assumptions, it's important for me to highlight here that for most part, as I've already highlighted a couple of minutes back, for most part of our discussion, these assumptions will hold true, but there are going to be cases where we would relax these assumptions and look at certain concepts. So that's important to have on top of our heads. So the first assumption is only two sources of finance. So that is the first assumption, only two sources of finance. So when I say only two sources of finance, the obvious question is, what are these two sources of finance? We are going to assume debt and equity are the only two sources of finance. What this means is, we do not talk about preference shares here. So for a lot of concepts, we are not going to be talking about preference. In fact, for all the concepts, we are not going to be talking about preference shares. So we are assuming that debt and equity are the only two sources of finance. Now, is it right to make this assumption here? We are not going to get inside, we are not going to look at answering this question about whether it is right to make this assumption that there are only two sources of finance. We have to accept this assumption here, because a lot of concepts that we are going to discuss after this would be theories which were propounded by financial experts, and in propounding those theories, they have assumed that there are only two sources of finance which a company would look at, debt and equity. So if we look at those concepts, then we do not have a choice actually. We'll also have to accept this assumption. But let me tell you that when we looked at EBIT to EPS analysis, we didn't have this assumption here. There, in EBIT to EPS analysis discussions, we did consider preference shares as a source of finance. So this assumption is only going to be for the remaining concepts that we will look at in capital structure. So that's important again to keep in mind. Second is debt is irredeemable. That is the second assumption. So what we mean by irredeemable is that there is no question of repayment of the principal. So once a company has raised finance in the form of debt, the only obligation for the company would be regular payment of interest on debt or regular payment of coupon. So that's the only obligation. There is no obligation for the company to repay the principal value. So that's the meaning of the second assumption. Third assumption is no taxes. So we are not talking about tax. In fact, in the cost of capital discussion, we understood that cost of debt has a lot of tax implications. And in fact, debt finance as such has a lot of tax implication. But here we are going to assume that there are no taxes. And this is one assumption that we will relax later when we look at one or two concepts. So for a lot of concepts, we will still assume that there are no taxes, but for one or two, we will relax this assumption here. Then we have the fourth assumption, which says 100% dividend payout. Now, what this means is the entire earnings available to equity shareholders is paid off as dividend, is distributed as dividend to the shareholders, and there is nothing which is retained. So that's what the fourth assumption would mean. And the fifth assumption is all investors are equally informed and have the same expectations. So this is the fifth assumption. Now, in a while, we will understand what is the meaning of this assumption and why this assumption, in fact, is important for discussion. Now, so there are four principles and there are five assumptions here. Now, what we are going to do is we are going to take each principle and try to focus on understanding that. And while we do that, we are also going to be looking at the assumptions. So we will take a principle, and each principle will have certain assumptions associated with those principles for discussion. So when we finish discussing all the four principles, we will also finish discussing all the basic assumptions. And let me repeat once again that these principles and basic assumptions are very important. And whenever you feel that there are some questions which might probably seem unanswered, they are probably answered through one or two of these assumptions here. So let's take the first principle here, which says value of a firm is equivalent to value of equity plus value of debt. Let's look at the first principle here. Now, for understanding this, let's take the example of a simple balance sheet. Okay. Now, let's say the company has assets, the firm has assets of 100. Now, uh, if someone asks what is the value of the company, what is the value of the firm, now let's try to dig a little deeper into this and try to understand what is in fact the meaning of the question. What is someone meaning when they ask what is the value of the firm? Now, how do you think a company or firm will generate value? A company or firm will generate value by doing business, because a firm is basically in existence to do business. So any entity will increase its value by pursuing the goal for which it exists, and it would probably focus on increasing its value by pursuing that goal in a better way. So I can say a company would derive value by doing business and could probably focus on increasing value by doing better business. So the most important point here is to understand that it is business or the pursuit of business that gives a company or a firm its value. Now the next question is, how is business to be performed, and or what do I mean when I say the business is happening, or what do I mean when I say the business is, this company is getting increased business, or the business for this company is reducing? So what do I mean by that? Basically, revenue is very closely tied with business. So when I say that my business is increasing, then probably I refer to the fact that my sales are increasing. So my revenue is increasing. So that would probably be what I mean when I say my business is increasing. So value of a firm is closely tied with the business that is happening, and business is closely tied with the revenue, and to generate revenue we understand that we require assets. So we can understand that value of a firm is basically linked to assets. So if you have assets of 100, it is these assets that help you do business, and it is this business that gives the value to the firm. So we are now going to say that value of a firm is equivalent to the value of all the assets that the firm has. This is what is very famously called as the asset based valuation approach. So asset based valuation approach. So what the asset based valuation tells us is the value of a firm is equivalent to the value of all assets that the firm has. Now, is this the only way in which a firm has to be valued? Definitely not. There are other ways also in which the firm can be valued. In fact, when we look at the fourth principle here, we will be looking at a different way in which a firm is to be valued. All I want to say here is that the asset based valuation is one way in which a firm can be valued and is one of the most famous approaches adopted for valuing a firm. So now we are basically saying the value of a firm is equivalent to the value of its assets. Now that we understand this, the next important thing we need to look at is how is a firm going to get assets? Basically, assets refer to investment in those assets. So when I say a company has assets of 100, the other way in which I can refer to this is that a company has invested its finance in assets. So now it's important to understand that assets basically refer to investment in those assets, and investment in those assets is possible only if finance is available, and finance is something that has to be raised. So if investment in assets has to happen, then financing those assets is also equally important. So now let's look at how these assets are financed. So that's what we can understand if we look at the liability side of the balance sheet. So let's assume that 60 of 60% of the finance required for investment is obtained in the form of equity, and 40%, which is the balance finance required, is obtained in the form of debt. And together we have 100 of finance, which is what is invested in the assets. So now what we understand here is if a company needs to have 100 of assets or investment of 100 in assets, it needs financing of 100. And I have taken an example where I have assumed that 60% of the finance comes in the form of equity and 40% of finance comes in the form of debt. Now, one question here is, why have I not considered preference shares? Well, you might have guessed it right. We have the first assumption here, which says only two sources of finance, debt and equity. So because of the first assumption here, I am assuming that there are only two sources, debt and equity. So we have assets 100, which is assets of 100 financed by equity and debt in the ratio of 3:2. Now, this definitely tells us that if I want to know what is the value of the firm, I can look at the value of assets and say that in this case, the value of the firm is 100. Or alternatively, what I can do is instead of looking at the asset side of the balance sheet, I can look at the liability side of the balance sheet and say, let me take equity value, let me add debt value, and together I'm going to get the same 100 which I would have got if I looked at the assets. So this is why the first principle goes to tell that value of the firm is equivalent to value of equity plus value of debt. This is mainly because we'll have to understand value of the firm as value of assets first, and then we should understand value of assets as value of equity and value of debt. So this is the first principle, and in looking at this first principle, we have also looked at the operation of the first assumption. Now let's look at the second principle here, which says value of debt is equivalent to interest divided by cost of debt. Now, this is something that is not new to us. In fact, when we say value of debt is equivalent to interest divided by cost of debt, this is something that we have actually seen when we looked at cost of debt discussion in the cost of capital lectures. Basically, the value of a bond was the present value of all the cash flows associated with the bond, discounted using the return on debt investment for the investors or the cost of debt finance for the company. Now here what's happening is we are looking at value of debt. The only difference is there in the discussion of cost of debt, we basically always took the price of one bond. We took the price of one bond. The price of one bond was the value of the bond. And what we did is is we said the price of one bond or the value of one bond is the present value of all the cash flows associated with that bond. So if we took the price or value of a single bond, then we took the cash flows associated with that bond. Here what we are doing is we are not talking about a single bond, we are talking about debt as such. So we don't want to find out the value of probably one debt security. We want to find out the value of the total debt. So all that we have to understand here is when we spoke about one bond, if we looked at cash flows associated with that bond, when we speak about total debt, we should talk about cash flows associated with total debt. And here we should not be talking about cash flows associated with one debt security, because we are talking mainly about the value of total debt. So that's why you can see here in the numerator, you can see interest here. So this interest that you see in a numerator is not the interest on one debenture or one bond or any one debt security. It is the total interest on the entire amount of finance raised in the form of debt. So interest here talks about total interest. So if finding out the price of one bond or value of one bond requires the discounting of cash flows associated with that bond, then finding out the value of the entire debt requires the discounting of the entire cash flows associated with total debt. Now here, since we have assumed that debt is irredeemable, the only cash flows associated with debt would be interest cash flows. That's why you don't see any cash flow with respect to principal coming here in this formula. So we see only interest because we assume that debt is irredeemable. And further, one thing that will not change between our discussion and cost of debt and here is the discounting is going to happen at the cost of debt rate. So the cost of debt was what was used to discount the cash flows associated with the bond to get the bond price. Similarly here, the cost of debt is what is going to be used to discount all the interest cash flows to get the value of it. So that's not going to change. And since we assume that the debt is irredeemable, we are basically talking about discounting perpetual interest. So whenever we have a perpetual stream of cash flows and we need to bring it to present value, we obviously have to use the formula which says present value of perpetuity is cash flow divided by R. So here what we are doing is perpetual total interest cash flows is discounted at the cost of debt rate that will give us the value of debt. So that is the logic for the second principle here. Now let's go to and in doing that, what we also understand is the second assumption is taken care of. Now let's go to the third assumption here, third principle here. Value of equity is EBIT minus interest divided by cost of equity. Let's understand what this would mean. Now, value of equity is EBIT minus interest divided by cost of equity. So let's again first link this with the discussion that we have had about equity in the cost of equity lecture earlier as a part of the cost of capital lectures. Now we understand that the price of a share or the value of a share is the present value of all the cash flows or the earnings associated with one share. Now if you recollect the dividend model, now what did the dividend model do? It discounted all the future dividends associated with one share to present value, and that is what we called as the value of a share. If we use the earnings model, what did we do? We took all the future earnings of a single share or future earnings for a single share and we discounted all those earnings to present value. So that is what we called as the value of a share. So we either use the earnings model or we use the dividend model. But basically what we did is some metric, either dividends or earnings, available to every share is what we discounted to present value. Now let's see what's happening here. Here in our discussion, we are not focused on finding out the value of one share. Rather, we are focused on finding out the value of the entire equity. So when we talk about finding out the value of entire equity, we do not talk about a metric associated with just one share, we talk about the metric, we talk about a metric associated with entire equity. So when we talk, if we talk about dividends, we don't talk about dividend for one share. We talk about the total dividend. We talk about dividend for all shares. And if we talk about earnings, we don't talk about earnings for one share. We talk about earnings for all shares. So it's either total earnings or it is total dividend that we will have to bring to present value to find out the value of equity. And we understand that the discount rate that is to be used to find out the price of a share is cost of equity. So the cash flows associated or the earnings associated with one share is to be discounted using the cost of equity. Just like the cash flows associated with one bond is to be discounted using cost of debt, the cash flows or the earnings associated with one share is to be discounted using cost of equity. Now that's not going to change here, because what is only changing is we are not finding out the value of one share, we are finding out the value of total equity. But just like in the case of debt, the discount rate did not change. Here also the discount rate is not going to change. We are going to be still discounting only using cost of equity. And in the case of a share, we have always assumed perpetual earnings or perpetual dividends. So we have something in the numerator which is the metric that is going to be forming a perpetual stream, and that's what we discount to present value using KE. All we need to now focus is what is this numerator here. Now we have earnings before interest and tax. Now from this we subtract interest, then what we get is earnings before tax. So now what it looks like what we are doing is we are taking the earnings associated, we are taking the earnings before tax, and we are saying that we are going to have perpetual EBT, and we are discounting perpetual EBT to present value using KE, and that is what we call as the value of equity. Now, are we correct in discounting perpetual EBT? The point here is, now you might say that we'll have to subtract tax from this and then get EAT. It is EAT, and then from this we are supposed to subtract preference dividend, and it is actually in fact PAES, profit available to equity shareholders. This is what has to be discounted to present value. So when I say PAES, what I mean here is profit available to all equity shareholders. So if I'm following the earnings method, then probably I can take this entire value and say that I'm going to talk about perpetual profit available to all equity shareholders and discount that to present value using KE. I will get the value of equity. So it looks like it is incorrect for us to use EBT. In fact, we have skipped 2 steps. We are supposed to ideally be using PAES. But here is where the assumptions are going to help us in understanding why what we are doing is correct. Since we have assumed that there is no tax, I'm going to say EBT is equivalent to EAT. Now, and since further we have assumed that there is no preference shares, there are only 2 sources of finance, debt and equity, I'm going to say EAT is equivalent to profit available to equity shareholders. Because since if there is not going to be any finance raised from preference shares, then where is the question of any preference dividend? So EBT is equivalent to EAT, and EAT is equivalent to PAES, which means we can definitely conclude saying EBT is equivalent to profit available to equity shareholders, and EBIT minus interest basically is nothing but EBT, which is PAES. So we are actually not doing anything wrong here. And whatever we're doing here is justified by 2 assumptions. One assumption which says there is no tax, and another assumption which says there are only 2 sources of finance. So these are 3 assumptions, 3 principles that we have discussed here. And in doing so, let's look at what are the several assumptions that we have understood. The first assumption is something that we have looked at. The second assumption is something that we have looked at. The third assumption is something that we have looked at. Now, before we go to the 4th principle, let's try to understand the 4th and the 5th assumption here using the 3rd principle itself, and then let's finally go to the 4th principle. So we have the 4th and 5th assumption here. Let's try to understand what these would mean. Now, if EBIT minus interest, which is EBT, is also equivalent to profit available to equity shareholders, then from this discussion it looks like we are using total earnings as the metric to be discounted to present value. So it looks like we are finding out the value of equity using earnings method. Now, in fact, I will tell you that we are not only following the earnings method, we are also following the dividend method, because the fourth principle tells us 100% payout. So what this essentially means is, I have my earnings before interest and tax. From that I subtract interest, I have earnings before tax. There is no tax, so it automatically becomes earnings after tax. There is no preference dividend, automatically it becomes PAES. And since we have assumed that there is 100% payout, entire thing is distributed to shareholders. So this is a case where, because of assuming that there is a 100% payout, whether you call it dividend method or you dividend model or you call it earnings model, it's not actually going to alter the value of equity, only because we have assumed there is 100% payout. So which model are we following here for value of equity? Well, you call it dividend model if you want, or you call it earnings model if you want. Since this assumption is there, it's not going to make any difference. So that's how we understand the operation of the fourth assumption. And now let's look at the fifth assumption. All investors are equally informed and have the same expectations. What is the significance of this assumption? How should we understand that with the third principle that we have discussed here? Now, when we talk about EBIT minus interest being the PAES, and then that is completely distributed, all that is fine. But now let's look at the discount rate here. Now we understand that we should discount the cash flows associated with equity at the cost of equity. So that's not something we are going to debate about. But the question is, there could be many shareholders for a company. Every shareholder could probably have a certain requirement with respect to the return on investment. So which shareholder's return would become the cost of equity for the company? Now, to give a simple example here, let's say there are 5 shareholders in a company. Shareholder 1 is sacrificing an investment avenue which is giving him 12%, and he is investing his money in equity. So he requires a minimum return of 12%. Shareholder 2 is sacrificing another avenue that gives him 16% return, and he is investing his money in the equity of the company. So he requires a minimum return of 16%. Shareholder 3 requires a minimum return of 8%. Shareholder 4 requires a minimum return of 13%, let's say, and shareholder 5 requires a minimum return of 10%. Now you have seen 5 different shareholders asking for 5 different returns on their respective investments in equity. Now, which one of these should I call as the cost of equity for the company? Now, because we shouldn't have a problem like this when we start discussing the concepts, we have the fifth assumption that helps us, which says all investors are equally informed and have the same expectations. So what this actually means here is, when we say same expectations, if one shareholder expects 10% return while investing in while considering the investment in equity, probably any other shareholder is also going to expect only 10%. So that's what we mean when we say all investors have the same expectations. So is this the best assumption possible when we talk about equity investment? Definitely not. But at the end of the day, since we are looking at some theories which do have these assumptions, we'll also have to accept these assumptions if we will have to appreciate the concepts covered in those theories here. So we now look at how the 5 assumptions work. We have discussed 3 principles. It's the last principle that we'll have to discuss here, which basically says value of a firm is equivalent to EBIT divided by WACC. So what is the logic behind this formula here? Now, we have already seen one principle earlier which focused on value of a firm. This principle is also going to focus on value of a firm, but the only thing is here, this principle is going to approach the calculation of value of a firm following the earnings model. So we are going to have an earnings based approach for calculating the value of a firm. Earlier we had an asset based approach. So now we have an earnings based approach. Now we are basically saying that earlier we said the value of a firm is the value of all the assets it has, because it's the assets which help the firm do business. Now we are basically saying the value of a firm is nothing but the present value of all the future earnings. Well, if a firm exists today, what is the rationale behind its existence? The business that it expects to do in the coming years. And the business that it expects to do in the coming years must translate to earnings, and those earnings that it expects to make in all the future, all the years to come, those earnings brought to present value is the value of the existence of the firm. So when I say value of a firm, basically I can understand this as the value of the existence of the firm. And why does the firm exist? To get earnings in all the years to come. So if I take all the earnings, future earnings, and if I discount them to present value, the present value of all the earnings is what I call as the value of the firm if I follow the earnings based approach. And you may ask me, for how many years do I have to consider earnings? Since we have the going concern principle, which tells us that at any given point in time, we are not we are assuming that for an unforeseeable future, the firm is going to continue to exist. We do not know when the firm will shut down. So because of that, we are going to look at perpetual earnings. So as of now, if I look at a firm, I'm going to say this firm probably is going to have earnings for an unforeseeable future. So we are talking about discounting perpetual earnings to present value. Now, here we understand that. Let's also bring in the knowledge that we obtained when we looked at the first principle. When I say the value of the firm, the next question is value to whom? Value of a firm is fine, but the firm's value to whom? Here we say the firm's value to the fund providers, because basically the firm is doing its operations, it's able to operate, it's able to do business only because the fund providers extend finance. So when the firm gets earnings, who would share those earnings? The fund providers would share those earnings. So when we say value of a firm here, we are talking about the value to the fund providers, because it is the fund providers who represent the firm. Now let's try to look at the first principle. Now if you say the value of the firm is the value of assets, then that also means value of the firm is represented by value of the fund providers. So here when we talk about the value of the firm, we are talking about value to the fund providers. This is very important to keep in mind before we approach this principle here. So two things we have seen as of now in the fourth principle. It's an earnings based approach for calculating the value, and further we are looking at value from the perspective of the fund providers. Now if I take a certain earnings level and I need to consider that for discussion, it's important that the earnings level that I look at is logical with respect to the fund provider that I'm looking at. For what does this mean? If I talk about a debt investor, I should probably talk only about the cash flows that a debt investor is eligible for, or I should talk about the earnings that a debt investor is eligible for. If I talk about an equity investor, if I talk about equity as a group, I should talk about cash flows associated with equity. So if I talk about a certain group, if I want to find out the value for a certain group, then now what actually is happening is we find out value of a firm, then we find out value of debt, and we find out value of equity. We are basically breaking up value of a firm into value of debt and equity. When we spoke about value to one type of fund provider, we talk about an earnings or a cash flow metric which is relevant to that type of a fund provider. When we speak about debt, we speak about interest. When we speak about equity, we speak about earnings with respect to equity, or earnings associated with equity. Now here when we talk about value of firm as such, and then we are using earnings model, earnings approach, we should talk about a level of earnings that is relevant for all the fund providers put together. Here we are not segregating the fund providers. We are talking about value of a firm. So we are talking just about one group called fund providers. These fund providers would have debt providers and would also have equity providers. We are not distinguishing between fund providers here. We are talking only about one group. That would also mean that when we talk about earnings, we should talk about that level of earnings which is available to all fund providers. And we know that if we should look at a certain level of earnings available to all fund providers, it has to be EBIT, which is earnings before interest and tax. So all fund providers together can take EBIT, and then that EBIT is split between the two fund providers here. Out of the entire EBIT, debt person takes interest, and the equity guys would probably take the EBIT minus interest. Since we assume there are no taxes here and there is no preference dividend payment here, the interest is taken by the debt person, the debt guys, and the EBIT minus I, which is the balance, is shared by the equity guys. So, but if both of them are together and we look at fund providers as such, Then the level of earnings we should look at is EBIT. So it's important to understand that what needs to get discounted is EBIT. And we are talking about discounting perpetual EBIT. And the most important thing now we should look at is what we need to use to discount is the WACC. The discount rate we need to use for discounting perpetual EBIT is the WACC, is the weighted average cost of capital, or is simply the average cost of capital. Now, why should we do that? It's pretty simple. When we speak about the value of debt, we take the cash flows associated with debt, we use the cost of debt. When we take the value of equity, we look at the cash flows or the earnings associated with equity, we use the cost of equity. Now, are we looking at any fund provider specifically? No, we are looking at the group. We are talking about one group called fund providers. Since we have considered the earnings available to all fund providers, it doesn't make sense if we talk about one specific cost. We should talk about the overall cost or the average cost. That is why we use WACC, weighted average cost of capital here. So here we are basically looking at the value of firm using the earnings based approach, considering all the fund providers to form part of one group. So that's the logic of using WACC as a discount rate here. So this concludes our discussion on the basic principles and also on the 5 assumptions. So now that we have looked into all of those, let's look at how the remaining concepts in this topic would be structured. So now we are going to be looking at capital structure theories. So basically, when I talk about capital structure theories, what I mean here is guidance given by financial experts in the form of theories with respect to the structuring of capital. So just like you have theories propounded by financial experts which give guidance regarding dividend payments, here we are looking at theories propounded by experts which give guidance regarding structuring of capital. So now we are going to look at expert theories on structuring of capital. So I'm going to classify the capital structure theories broadly into 2. So we have what we call as capital structure irrelevance theory, capital structure irrelevance theory. So this is one classification, and the other is capital structure relevance theory. So there are some theories that we call as capital structure irrelevance theories, and there are some theories that we call as capital structure relevant theories. Now, what do I mean when I say capital structure irrelevance theory, and what do I mean when I say capital structure relevance theory? The meaning of irrelevance or relevance, or the way I should understand irrelevance or relevance here, is exactly similar to how someone must understand irrelevance or relevance in the context of dividend theories. The capital structure or the capital structuring about which we want to seek guidance, we understood focuses on one important parameter called as the value of the firm. So basically what we are saying is, how should I structure my capital to ensure that the value of the firm is maximized? So this would mean that when I ask a question, how should I structure my capital in such a way that the value of the firm is maximized? What does it implicitly tell me? It tells me that different capital structures can have different can lead to different values for the firm. This is what it means. So a capital structure which has 80% debt and 20% equity could have a certain value. A capital structure having 60% equity and 40% debt could have a different value. So what structure should I adopt for my firm's value to be maximized? Now here is where irrelevance theories tell us that the capital structure has no impact on the value of firm. So what this actually means is, when I say irrelevance theory, the capital structure, these theories tell us no impact on value of the firm. So any capital structure is as good as any other capital structure. This is what irrelevance theory tells us. And the greater meaning that we'll have to look at when these theories tell us any capital structure is as good as any other capital structure, what they are indirectly telling us is if a firm really wants to focus on maximizing its value, it should focus on doing better business as such, and it should not probably look at structuring capital. So what it says is a firm which has assets of 100 would have a certain value. A firm which has assets of 200 would definitely have a higher value. Let's not look at how the 200 is structured. A firm having assets of 100 could have equity financing of 60% and debt financing of 40%. A firm that has assets of 200 could have debt financing of 180 and equity financing of just 20. Doesn't matter. The firm having higher assets would have higher value. So it's basically the business or the operations that would contribute to increasing the firm value. The composition of finance or the structuring of capital will not affect the value of the firm, is what these theories tell us. So these theories do not tell that the value of the firm can never be maximized. They only say that it is capital structure that you should not look at if you want to focus on value, maximizing the value of the firm. Please focus on the business operations. See how better you could focus on the business operations. See how better you could start probably marketing, or how you could cut down other costs, and how could you increase your productivity. So probably focus on all of these things. Do not focus on how the capital has to be structured. So that's what these theories tell us. Now, what do the other theories tell us? The relevance theories, they exactly tell us the opposite. They tell us that capital structure will have an impact on the value of the firm. You cannot say that any capital structure is as good as any other capital structure. 80% debt, 20% equity would give you a value for the firm which is completely expected to be different from probably a 60% debt and a 40% equity. So that's what relevance theory would mean. So again, let me draw a parallel. This is something that we have seen in the context of dividend theories also, irrelevance theories and relevance theories. So whether capital structure will have an impact on the value of the firm, that's the main focus here, right? So again, we are not going to be concluding which is right, which is not right here, although we will focus on the shortcomings of a certain theory, and we will focus on how certain other theories are slightly probably better. But we are not going to conclude that this is the best theory, right? All of these are theories. They have their own assumptions, and probably at the point in time when these theories were propounded, those assumptions all also made sense, right? So now looking at an assumption which says there is no tax, or looking at an assumption which says there is no preference share, well, it looks atrocious to us right now. But probably 70, 75 years back, if there were only two sources of finance, debt and equity, right? Loans were one way in which a firm could raise finance, and equity is another way. Then those experts made sense when they assumed that these are only two ways. They're actually in fact telling that, look, my theory considers the two sources of finance available when I wrote this theory. If you have a certain different source of finance coming up later, it wasn't considered at the time the theory was propounded at all. So it's important to understand that assumptions probably would have made sense if you look at the point in time the theory was propounded. Many assumptions now may not make sense. So it's foolish to conclude that a certain theory is a bad theory. All you can say is it probably is not very suitable to the context right now. That's something you can definitely conclude, but you cannot conclude saying a theory is a bad theory or another theory is a good theory, right? So that's something about theories as such, not just capital structure theories, but theories at large. Now, what we are going to do right now is we're going to first look at uh, we are going to be shuttling between capital structure irrelevance theories and capital structure relevance theories. We are first going to look at a certain theory which is classified as an irrelevance theory. And after that, we will look at a relevance theory. And then at some point in time later, we are again going to come back to irrelevance theory and again go back to. So that's what we're going to be shuttling between irrelevance theories and relevance theories. But we'll appreciate the concept that each theory is trying to drive home and how each theory is trying to guide us with respect to which source of finance or is the best for a company or how a company should structure its capital. So now what we will do is we will look at a theory called as Modigliani and Miller theory. We will look at Modigliani and Miller theory. So now um, we are going to first look at this theory, assuming that there is no tax. So we are going to go with that assumption, and later we are going to introduce tax and see what actually happens. So for the time being, right now, we are going to look at. Let me make that clear here. Modigliani Miller theory, no tax, and later we will see what happens if tax is introduced. So now let's see what this theory actually tells us. Now this is to be classified as an irrelevance theory. So basically what this theory tells us is any capital structure is as good as any other capital structure. Any capital structure is as good as any other capital structure. So ultimately, what this means is the value of the firm will not be affected by changes in capital structure. So let's make that also a little clear here. Um, Value of the firm not affected by capital structure. Now, once we understand the crux of the theory here, we should understand how Modigliani and Miller prove this theory. They are giving an operational explanation for this theory. They are basically telling that the value of the value of a firm is not going to be affected by capital structure, or if there are two firms which are exactly similar to each other but for the capital structure, their values cannot be different. That's what Modigliani and Miller tell us. Two firms which are exactly similar to each other but for their capital structure cannot have different values just because they have different capital structures. This is what Modigliani and Miller tell us through this theory. Now, how they in fact try to strengthen their point of view is by telling what could happen if at all they have different values. So now we are going to be talking mainly about two firms. We are going to talk about a firm called VL and another firm called VU. So when we say VL, what we mean here is value of a levered firm. So VL is value of a levered firm, and when we say VU, we are basically saying value of an unlevered firm. So again, we understand that a levered firm is a firm in which there is the presence of debt, An unlevered firm is a firm in which there is only equity, there is no debt. So basically, these are two firms which have two different capital structures. So a levered firm has some amount of debt and some amount of equity. The unlevered firm has only equity. So from that sense, we can say that both of these firms are having different capital structures. Now, what Modigliani and Miller say is value of the levered firm has to be equivalent to value of unlevered firm, provided both of these firms are otherwise similar. If VL is similar to VU except for capital structure. So except for capital structure, let's say both of these firms are in the same business, they manufacture the same products, they face the same types of risk in their business operations. Everything else is the same. Only thing is VU doesn't have any debt finance at all, and VL definitely has some debt finance. Let's not look at what is the proportion of debt finance, but VL has some debt finance. Except for that, they're in the same business, they manufacture the same products or render the same services, they face the same business risks, everything is the same. Then Modigliani and Miller tell us that VL must be equivalent to VU. In other words, the levered firm's value must be equivalent to the unlevered firm's value. Now, how how is this proposition of Modigliani and Miller strengthened? Basically, they tell us what can happen if this is not going to hold true. Suppose there is a levered firm and there is an unlevered firm. They are in the same business, they manufacture the same products, render the same services, and they face the same risk. Everything is similar except for the capital structure, yet they have a different value, which is against what Modigliani and Miller propose. They say that something can be done, and through that, eventually both of the firms will again come to have the equal value. So if they have a difference in their value, Modigliani and Miller say that that difference is completely temporary, and there is something that can be done to ensure that the difference vanishes, and at a point in time, the value of the levered firm again becomes equivalent to the value of unlevered firm. So what is that one thing that can be done to ensure that if at all there is any difference between levered firm and unlevered firm, the difference vanishes? So what is that one thing? That's going to be the focus of our discussion here. That's called as arbitrage. So what Modigliani and Miller tell us is, if at all you find a levered firm to have a different value than an unlevered firm compared to an unlevered firm, and you feel that they should not be having different values, and yet you find different values, go ahead and do this activity of arbitrage. And if arbitrage is done, eventually the levered firm and unlevered firm will at some point in time be equal in value. Now, what is this arbitrage? Now, this is something that you're going to be learning in a lot of detail at the CA final SFM level. But for the time being, at the FM level, this is the only place in which you see this arbitrage here. So I'm going to be explaining the concept of arbitrage as required in the context right now, and only to the extent that you require. So at a high level, at this stage, what you should understand of arbitrage is it is an activity to exploit something to ensure that, one, you make a gain for yourself, and two, to remove any inefficiencies. So let me repeat that once again. An activity that is done to exploit something, I would say some mispricing or some inefficiency outside, with two goals. One, to make a gain for yourself, and two, to remove that mispricing. So there are key things here. There is a mispricing or there is a misvaluation, and you are exploiting that misvaluation to make a gain for yourself, and also to ensure that over a period of time that mispricing goes away. Just to take a very simple example of an arbitrage, let's say there's one share. Now, in India, we understand there are two recognized stock exchanges. One is the NSE and the other is the BSE. So many shares trade in both the exchanges. Let's say, for example, in the NSE, the price of the share is 110, and in the BSE, the price of the share, let's say, is 111. Now, can this happen? Ideally, it should not happen because this is one share of a certain company. It's only that it is trading in two platforms. The share is available for transaction in two platforms. NSE is one platform and BSE is another platform. But for that, it is just the same company's share available in two platforms. It doesn't make sense if it is available at two different prices in both of these platforms. But this does happen sometimes. So this definitely does happen sometimes. Maybe 1 rupee is not the difference. You could probably say 110 rupees and 25 paise is the share price in NSE, 110 rupees and 75 paise is the share price in BSE. Yet still, I mean, still it's a difference, right? A difference is a difference, however small it is. Ideally, even that must not be there. But sometimes these things do happen. You can spot the same share trading in two different platforms at different prices. Now, if something like this happens, without questioning why this has happened, what we can do is we can start buying the shares in NSE and we can start selling the shares in BSE. Or I'm sorry, we can start definitely, yeah, we can start buying the shares in NSE and we can start selling the shares in BSE. Now, why do we do that? Because we know that for one share that we purchase in NSE and we sell in BSE, we make a gain of 1 rupee. We are able to buy the share at 110 and we're able to sell the share at 111. So for every share that we do, we make a gain of 1 rupee. So eventually what happens is, or eventually what you can expect to happen is, in NSE, since you start buying a lot more, the demand for shares would increase. So with demand increasing, you could probably expect the price to increase. And since you offload all the shares in BSE, you start increasing the supply there in BSE. And with increase in supply, we can expect the price to drop. So eventually you can expect NSE price for that one share and BSE price for that one share to come to an equilibrium. Now, when will this happen? How many such purchase and sale transactions should happen? What will be that equilibrium price at which they will settle down? These are things that we don't have an answer to right now. But the fact is that at least at a very high level, at a concept level, we can expect that this would happen if you buy shares at NSE and start selling shares at BSE. Now, this process is what we call as arbitrage, because we find a mispricing. Either both the shares must be trading at 110 or both the shares must be trading at 111, but we do find a mispricing or a misvaluation. And by doing this, what happens is, one, we are able to make a gain, and number two, the mispricing vanishes. So the inefficiency or the misvaluation, mispricing, whatever way you choose to call it, that vanishes by doing this activity of arbitrage. But let me tell you, in reality, doing arbitrage is not as simple as I've explained here in this example. There are a lot of things. It should make sense for you to do this transaction. And what I mean by this, for instance, if you buy at NSE and sell at BSE and it looks like your gain is 1 rupee, what if you have to pay a brokerage for your purchase and sale transaction that comes to 3 rupees? It doesn't make sense to pay 3 rupees brokerage for a 1 rupee gain. So you must be able to make a gain beyond transaction charges. So there are a lot of things. Long story short, arbitrage is not as simple as what I've explained here in this example. It takes a lot to do arbitrage. There should be no risk associated with doing this arbitrage. But the fact remains that you can do this arbitrage here. So that's exactly what Modigliani and Miller say that we can do in the context of a levered firm not being equivalent to an unlevered firm. If you don't find a levered firm's value to be equivalent to an unlevered firm's value, do not worry. You can do this arbitrage of buying stake in one company and selling stake in another company, and then eventually you can expect both of these to settle down in value. So how is this arbitrage to be done is going to be the subject matter for our discussion. But let me tell you here, we are only focused on performing the arbitrage. We are not focused on understanding when the two firms will settle down in value. That's not going to be the scope of our discussion right now. That is something that the marketplaces probably would decide. We do not have a control over that. We're just going to look at how that arbitrage has to be done. So let's look at this arbitrage pretty closely. So now, when will arbitrage be done? Basically, when value of a levered firm is not equivalent to value of unlevered firm. This is when an arbitrage will be done. But let me tell you, it does. A value of a levered firm must be equivalent to a value of an unlevered firm only if otherwise the two firms are similar and comparable, right? You can't say you can't say all levered firms must be equivalent to value of all unlevered firms. That doesn't make sense. So they must otherwise be comparable and must be similar. So let's say they are, and yet you find a difference. This is where arbitrage can happen. Now there are two possibilities. When I say value of a levered firm is not equivalent to value of an unlevered firm, uh, there are two possibilities. One is value of a levered firm is higher than value of an unlevered firm. This is one possibility. Or the other possibility obviously is value of a levered firm is lesser than value of an unlevered firm. So these are obviously only the two only possibilities. If none of these two possibilities hold true, then obviously the two values have to be equal. So only because they're not equal, we are even looking at these two possibilities here. So either the levered firm is higher in value to the unlevered firm or is lesser in value to the unlevered firm. Now, if the levered firm is higher in value to the unlevered firm, we do what we call as primary arbitrage. So the type of arbitrage or the way in which the arbitrage will be carried out is called as primary arbitrage. And in case we are in the second situation, the levered firm is lesser in value compared to the unlevered firm, then we do the arbitrage in another way, and that's called as secondary arbitrage. So either we do a primary, if at all we have to do an arbitrage, first thing, the two values are not equal, then either we do a primary arbitrage or we do a secondary arbitrage. So now there are, in your problems material, there are two questions for primary arbitrage and there are two questions for secondary arbitrage. I'm going to break this question, these two primary arbitrage questions, I'm going to break them into two. One question will be done in the class, and an elaborate discussion will happen. So in this lecture, I'm going to solve one question and use this question as an opportunity to explain all the steps in the arbitrage and why each step is carried out and how they make sense. And there is another question which is something that you will have to do. It is homework, but the good thing is it is a study material question. It is an ICAI study material question. So you do have the solution there in the ICAI study material. But in fact, if you understand the one question that I'm going to work out in this lecture completely, then you can just replicate those steps when you look at the other question also to do primary arbitrage. There's not going to be any problem that you will face. All it requires for you to do is just replicate the steps. So for that, you'll have to understand completely how this one question is done and what is the logic behind why a certain thing is done the way it is done. So once you understand that, then the other question is going to be absolutely simple. After that, you can definitely check your solution with ICAI study material solution also. And and even if you don't do that, what I want to say is, so long as you're confident with your steps, you don't need to check about. Check with any other source for. Check whether the solutions actually match. It's not required, especially for questions like this. When you know that these are the only steps that need to be done, then you don't need to really check your solution with any other source. So that's about primary arbitrage questions. Similarly, secondary arbitrage questions also, there are two questions. One question I will be solving it right now. We will do it in this lecture. And the second question in secondary arbitrage obviously is going to be a homework question. But again, this again is picked from the ICAI study material. So again, like I said, in the case of primary arbitrage questions, if you follow the one question that I'm going to do right now, one question I'm going to solve in this lecture, and I'm also going to explain in a lot of detail, then replicating it is going to be absolutely simple as far as the other question is concerned. So for both primary and secondary arbitrage, it's important that you understand in detail how things actually work. So that's about primary arbitrage and secondary arbitrage. Now, a very important point that we'll have to make here before we proceed with any of the arbitrages, either the primary or the secondary arbitrage. Always the rule of arbitrage is simple. It is buy low and sell high. This is a very fundamental rule of arbitrage, and further this can be also expressed like this: buy the underpriced and sell the overpriced. So you buy the underpriced or you sell the overpriced. So buy the underpriced and sell the overpriced. So these are two things that you do in an arbitrage. So in the previous example, if you see, you bought the NSE share and you bought the share at NSE and you sold the share at BSE, right? So that's what we said we could do. Why? Because the price was lesser in NSE and the price was higher in BSE. So you buy the underpriced and you sell the overpriced. So that's a fundamental rule in arbitrage. Now here the word overpriced or underpriced has to be understood relatively. Now if you look at this NSE BSE example here, the share trading in two platforms at different prices. Now the question is 110 the correct price, and then do we say that 111 here is wrong? And then do we say that the share in BSE is overpriced because 110 is correct? Or do we say 111 is correct and then we say the share in NSE is underpriced? So how do we understand the words underpriced and overpriced? Well, let's not break our heads too much on that. Relatively, the price in NSE is underpriced. Relatively, the price in BSE is overpriced. So when you look at NSE price compared with BSE, you can say the share is underpriced. And when you look at BSE compared to NSE, the share is overpriced. So we are looking at underpricing or overpricing only in relative terms here, and we're not trying to look at one holy price and then benchmark two other prices with that holy price and say which one is overpriced or which one is underpriced. That's not the idea. We just need to make life very simple here by by making relative comparisons. So that's very important. So here what we'll do is in a primary arbitrage, we are going to be selling stake in the levered firm and buying stake in the unlevered firm. Simply because the value of the levered firm is higher, sell the overpriced, so sell stake in the levered firm, buy the underpriced, so buy stake in the unlevered firm. And that's the exact opposite thing that we are going to, and the exact opposite thing is what we are going to be doing when we go to secondary arbitrage. We are going to be selling stake in the unlevered firm and we are going to be buying stake in the levered firm, because we sell stake in the unlevered firm primarily because the unlevered firm is overpriced in comparison with the levered firm, and you know why we buy stake in levered firm. So this is how a secondary arbitrage is done, and you saw how a primary arbitrage has to be done. So both of these are basically at a high level. So before we get into the steps of the arbitrage, we are trying to understand what essentially we are going to be doing, and then we'll see how it needs to be carried out. So at this moment, let's understand up to here about what Modigliani Miller and theory tells us. But later we will understand that all this discussion here may not be making sense when we introduce tax. So all this is actually going to make sense only when we don't have tax in our picture. When we talk about Modigliani Miller theory with tax, and we're going to be taking one question and solving that, and take that as an opportunity to understand the principle there. At that point in time, we'll find most of these things not making sense. Well, we can expect it not to make sense because we are relaxing a certain assumption which we are holding tightly to in this context here. So let's have that in mind before we look at the primary arbitrage or the secondary arbitrage. So I will conclude this lecture here, and in the next lecture, let's go about uh, looking at primary arbitrage, secondary arbitrage, and also discussing concepts that are to follow.